So it's my absolute pleasure today to introduce you to Professor John Smyth. Now, there's a big bio here in your program outline or booklet. And so John is an emeritus professor at the University of Huddersfield. And prior to that, he was at Federation University, which is an amalgamation, I think, of Monash and Ballarat universities. I thought it was a new university, but no. And he's also an emeritus professor at Flinders University. So John has gotten around. And he's also a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, which is actually really quite hard to do. I'd really like to know how to do that. But rather than what's written here, for me, when I was thinking about who could be a keynote speaker at this conference, I thought of John straight away because John's work is so influential for people like me. And I've passed on one of his recent books to my master's student, Camilla, who has recently written a review on that book. And John has got a very strong voice, which I love. He can be fairly controversial because he says it how it is. And I like that. There's honesty in his work, and he stands up for young people, and he stands up for teachers. So I really hope that you enjoy what he has to say today. Please welcome John Smyth.
Thanks very much, Linda, and I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we're meeting on here today. And pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. Thank you for those opening comments, Linda, and I am going to incorporate you into part of the discussion here in a minute, assuming I can work this device here. That's the book that she spoke about. And to tell you something a little bit about our convener, she was spotted reading that book in a hairdresser's shop. What a sad life. But I am appreciative to Linda for giving me this opportunity to put out some of my ideas here, which, as she said, sometimes I'm not a pirate, but I'm pretty one-eyed. I think I could say that. I want to make a sort of point of entry into the paper I'm going to be talking about here today through something truly bizarre. I've just come back from Huddersfield. By the way, I don't sound like a native from England, and I'm not. I have a visiting position there, but I've just come back from Huddersfield, and one of the things that happened while I was in England was something quite bizarre. They decided that they were going to tackle the issue of student engagement by the appointment of what they called a classroom behaviour czar. Now, my understanding of the term czar is that it refers to a Russian emperor pre-1917. And the term brings with it, I think, a whole aura of brute decisiveness that really is quite worrying. It seems to me that the problem of disengaged children is somehow or other going to be fixed by resorting to some kind of muscular monarchical governance. And I find this quite a ludicrous idea. Now, it gets even more interesting than that, because the actual person who's been appointed as this behaviour czar was a guy called Tony Bennett, and he's a former nightclub manager. You see what I mean? I'm not sure this is the right kind of skill set, having an ex-bouncer that's going to be altogether helpful to try to resolve this rather complicated problem. Now, my reason for invoking this is that I think it's a rather kind of nice way about the simplicity of the way in which the problem was often seen in policy terms. The other thing that's equally bizarre about this new chieftain, this educational chieftain, is that he's going to provide a list of 10 tips for maintaining classroom discipline, according to the newspaper I read. It seems that these tips are going to be restricted to low-level disruption, such as passing notes in class, swinging on chairs or using mobile phones in class, all of which we're told is going to cost students exactly 38 days of lost learning a year. a very precise measurement. I guess we'll have to wait to the next instalment to see what the next 10 tips are and how we're going to deal with the really disruptive cases of student disengagement. You've probably got a sense already that I'm going to give a somewhat more complicated view of how this whole thing pans out. And there are really three animating questions that I want to get to today in my discussion. As you've seen in the title of the paper, I'm going to be talking about this concept of the relational school. And I think that'll set the kind of tone for where I'm going to. But I'm going to try and do this in a fairly rapid-fire kind of way too. So I've got an opening proposition. They're the opening propositions there. What is it? Where's it coming from? And what will it do for us? But first of all, I need to give you a little bit of background, I think. One of the things that animates me is the fact that I think people like yourselves, people like young people in schools, teachers and others, are far better at cutting through this complex issue than people like Russian czars, educational czars are. And recently, Peter Hutton, who's the principal of Templestowe Secondary College in Victoria, recently summarised the situation, I think, in a fairly nice way when he said that school isn't working for very large numbers of kids. And he went on to describe three particular groups. He says that school only works for about a third of students. These are the kids that, while they're not actually maximising their learning, they're at least getting by. He says they've learned how to play the school game and they end up reasonably happy kids. That's 1/3 of them. He says there's a middle third, which are the kids that don't get much out of school. And he says nor do they put very much into it. They're what he calls the chronic under-investors. And then he says there's the bottom third, and these are the bottom feeders for whom school, in his terms, is absolutely disastrous. He says they can't or won't play the game, and they never find any passion in their lives in school. Now, this is a point I think that someone at QUT, Rebecca English, has picked up, and she argues that she's actually entirely in agreement with Hutton's analysis of this in an article that she wrote. So the basic problem seems to be, when we look at this, is that we're somehow or other constructing schools in which a learning identity is becoming increasingly irrelevant to increasingly large numbers of kids. And I'm talking here about, most notably, the ones who come from the lower socioeconomic groups. And my take on this is that we certainly need some radical action. Not always the radical action of the kind that's talked about in policy circles or even in the newspapers. But I'm not quite sure that Peter Hutton has quite got it right yet, I think, in terms of his categorisation, although some people will see it that way. Now, the way I want to get into these issues is by looking at a study that I did quite a few years ago in 1996 in South Australia with a number of my colleagues there, which has turned out to be probably one of the first and one of the most intensive studies of early school leaving, student disengagement, the ultimate end of it, in which we did something quite, I think, radical, and it's not been extensively replicated in this country yet. And that was, we talked to vast numbers of young people. We didn't do any questionnaires with them. We didn't measure anything. We didn't even go into schools, as a matter of fact. We found these kids who dropped out of school. We had to chase 800 of them in order to finish up being able to have conversations with 200 of them. That in itself was an interesting exercise, I can tell you that. Now, out of that, we've published extensively, and I'm going to do a quick run through in the later part of this presentation, the books that have followed on from that, and give you a kind of a quick snapshot of some of the things that actually occurred as a result of the follow-up work that we did. Now, what I'm trying to do here in 40 minutes, 39 minutes actually now, is to summarise 20 years of research. I'll try and do that by concentrating on the original report and then update it by making some reference to the later pieces as these help to reinforce what I'm saying. But first I have to tell you a little bit about the unconventional nature of the research. I've already hinted at it. To speak literally with hundreds, if not thousands, of young people in the research I've been doing is certainly not a conventional way of forming views about what works in schools or the effects of educational policies. And it's what my friend now departed Joe Kinchlow called using unauthorised methods. I would have thought they were pretty authorised, but in conventional circles they're not seen that way. That is, we're trying to give the underside story. And I have to say, this doesn't win you many friends in high places like politicians. Their response has been pretty resounding in the intervening period since the mid-90s when we did this research, to ignore our research and to silence our perspective. And when you see the titles, you'll probably get a sense of why. I'm going to do a bit of Dave Burgess here and keep you hanging on that for a minute. I won't have something in my pocket, though. The other aspect that makes our research somewhat controversial is that almost all of our informants, our young people, have been young people who, in the language that's used, have dropped out of school or given up, or in the process of doing so. I prefer to turn this notion around the other way. I think the notion of dropping out is an unfortunate turn of phrase. These are the kids who are seen, to use the language that's sometimes used, these are the lippy kids, you know the ones I'm talking about, the ones who speak back. Sometimes they're called the ferals, the troublesome kids. They're what I prefer to call just simply untidy kids, and I'm not talking about their dress codes either, and you'll see why in a moment. Now, these are the kids who I think, in Michelle Fine's terms, one of our researcher colleagues in the United States, calls the kids with the disruptive voices. She says they're not prepared to unquestionably accept the way schooling is. And she regards these kids as exiles. And she says what's really important about them is that while they've been silenced, she says, or pushed to the margins or shoved to the margins, they're branded as deviant, they're disparaged, they're ignored, at least at the policy level. And she says the thing about them that's interesting is that they're critics of the institution of schooling, and that's why they're often regarded as not being able to be listened to. Now, according to Michelle Fine, when young people are ridden over in terms of not being listened to, then they're blamed for their own demise. They're presented in deficit terms, and in her book, which she called Framing Dropout, she uses the term they're framed up. That is to say, they're blamed as being the problem. They're seen as being losers, as hopeless cases. And this kind of approach, I think, that she's talking about, deflects attention away from what might be dysfunctional about the school system, about educational policies, and the way we organise schooling in society in general. And I'll have a bit more to say about that later. The other thing that I need to tell you from the outset is that the majority of the young people that we've had conversations with about their schooling, in some shape or form, have come from backgrounds that are described, again, in scare quotes, as disadvantaged. And again, the language is really interesting here. I prefer to see these kids not as disadvantaged, not as coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, but as coming from backgrounds and circumstances where they have been put at a disadvantage. There's a very different inflection there. These are the kids who are regarded as being vulnerable at school because they come from family backgrounds, because of their family background, because of their Aboriginality, their limited parental education, regional or rural location, disability, ill health, disrupted family circumstances, homelessness, poverty or unemployment, and the list goes on. This group are increasingly no longer a minority in this country, sadly. They're actually becoming a significant part of a majority. And I think that's hardly a new observation, but it's one that's not always that well acknowledged. Now, having said all of this, you might think I'm going to finish up in the pits of despair here in a minute. Well, I'm not. My story that I'm going to tell you is, I think, one that's far from hopelessness. That's not to say there aren't some negative kind of aspects to it. The bottom line on what I'm going to be saying here today is that young people that we've had conversations with over the years, including the early study, turned out to be incredibly intelligent and courageous observers. And they were very adept at recognising what good schooling looks like. They were also equally forthright, very forthright as a matter of fact, in telling us what bad schooling felt like. So one of the strongest themes, I think, that's been coursing through this original study for me, right from the very beginning, has been what young people see as positive forms of schooling. I wouldn't have been able to continue doing this kind of work for 2 decades if all I was hearing was stories of gloom and doom. I can assure you of that. Now, I'll give you some glimpses of some parts of the research that I've been alluding to here. We interviewed 209 young people who had left school early or who were in the process of doing so in the Listen to Me study. And the essence of what they were saying, believe it or not, could be collapsed down to a single word. The way they saw it, school was all about relationships with their peers, with their teachers, with their school, their community, and their prospects of connecting to the world of work and further education. Now, I'm not going to read out the thing there, but I've included the cover of the book, and it may look to you as though it's completely out of focus. We did this kind of deliberately here. It's a sort of a pastiche of different kids' faces because it, and the title of it, "Listen to Me, I'm Leaving," I think is very interesting. If you can sort of see the quote there, yeah, because the teachers, they don't explain to you properly. This is what one kid said. They explain bits and pieces. They tell you to put your hand up and to ask, and they say, "Weren't you listening? You should listen." It's like, well, I was listening, but you don't get a chance to say it, but I still don't understand. So they go off their head and they say, "You're a waste of time. Why are you here? Just get up and get out, go home and forget about it all." I mean, I think that's a rather nice encapsulation of what many of these kids were saying. So these young people saw school as a place in which they were involved in trying to make and advance a worthwhile identity for themselves, and to whatever degree they could, they were searching for ways in which they might get the resources of the school to advance that project in what Philip Wexler has delightedly called the notion of becoming somebody. These young people were trying to become somebodies, as distinct from nobodies. They were trying to negotiate meaning in their lives and their futures, and for many of them, this was proving to be a pretty fraught process. And the way we summarised it in that study there went like this. The overriding theme that emerges from this study concerns a mismatch. The stories show how highly complex lives and relationships of young people. They show how very negative as well as positive experiences have often given them more maturity than the stereotyped picture of callow adolescence would have us expect. And the stories indicate how the school regime so often ignores this experience and maturity and instead demands compliance, punishes deviance, and generally treats them like children rather than as emerging adults. This mismatch is between the young people's project of becoming somebody and the school's agenda of doing what they say, doing what we say because we know best. Now, at essence, this study was arguing that early school leaving, or in its contemporary terms, and the language has moved on here, disengagement from school, needs to be understood in terms of how schools helped to construct identities of young people, yet seem to be unable to respond adequately and productively to the complexities of the lives that these young people often bring with them to school. Now, in the book that came out of the Listen to Me thing, called Dropping Out, Drifting Off, Being Excluded, Becoming Someone Without School, rather than blaming anyone, we described the problem as being one of mismatches around a number of themes, questions and actions. The young people were telling us that school fell off the agenda for them because the experience had become alienating and it was out of kilter with their struggles to become somebody. Peter Freebody at Sydney University described this very interestingly at one stage as he used the term interactive trouble. And it was a way in which he was talking about the messages that the school was giving out that was out of kilter with the kind of messages that young people themselves were actually feeding into the whole process. So what young people told us then in this study was that relationships of a number of kinds, for good or bad, could make or break their attempt at schooling. And we heard many examples of what this looked like. And there were a number of potential flashpoints. And sometimes these flashpoints are ones that often catch the media attention. A curriculum that was irrelevant to their lives, a teacher or teachers who didn't seem to understand what was going on in their lives. There was bullying and harassment. that while acknowledged at a policy level was left unchecked in practice. There was a punitive environment around behaviour management, suspension and exclusion that often resulted in inevitable failure and early school leaving, and difficulty on the part of school in understanding the need for young people to be involved in part-time work. This was a frequent story we heard, often because of dire economic circumstances in some cases, and the flexibility needed for this to occur. And there was also, we repeatedly heard, assessment practices that were actually at odds with the capacity of some young people to produce written tasks under stress and within particular timeframes. And finally, there was the feeling amongst many young people that the school credentialing process seemed to be designed for less than 30% of them, the ones that were headed for university. Now, equally, there were some very optimistic instances, I think, where some young people had, in parts of their lives, experienced schools that understood and connected to their lives, and they spoke about these in very positive ways. So the real issue here, for me then, is not that young people are voicing their perspectives on schooling, but rather, as Haddam put it, whether or not education systems can listen to these perspectives in ways that can affect policy and practice in favour of reforms that make the system work better, to end the quote, for those students who refuse to perform under the current conditions of schooling and society. Now, I want to flash back here to Peter Hutton for a minute. To return to Peter Hutton's categorisation, the three groups of kids. The kids we interviewed told us that there were broadly three kinds of schools. Hutton's talking about three kinds of kids. We actually listened to what the kids were telling us, and we reckoned that there were three dispositions, or three general types of schools that seem to be coming through in their commentary. And I guess that Hutton is probably talking about much the same kind of thing, although maybe starting from slightly different starting points. One of the things that did become clear to us, and I should say this, was that the top-down authoritarian approaches of the czarist kind that I referred to earlier are totally out of step with the bottom-up approaches that provided the spaces within which students can make sense of their lives. And this is where the culture of the school and its view of relationships becomes something that's really quite crucial. So in the Listen to Me, I'm Leaving study, we did what's called a backward mapping. We backward mapped what kids told us to help us to produce what we called in our work a geography of the high school. These were high school kids, around three possible trajectories that we characterised as follows. So there were three dispositions. And I should emphasise that these are not actually models. These are not instances of actual schools. They don't necessarily actually look exactly like this. Sometimes students described all three of these as all being mixed up together. They are tendencies or dispositions rather than models to be applied. So the first one of these is what we call the active school, and there are 8 dimensions of this which I'll lead you through. Can you read that at the back? Is that readable from the back? While we didn't actually start out to find out stories about schools that were actually working, we certainly found out about them in no uncertain terms from the young people. And one of the things that became very clear in their discussion was that what we called the active school, that is the school that was reaching out to and grasping, I suppose, the young lives and not merely responding to them, had some very distinct features to them. They were places in which student voice became really important. They were places in which schools were working reciprocally to try to create an environment which, regardless of background, all students had the opportunity to succeed. On the dimension of inclusion and exclusion, again, student voice was a kind of predominant theme in this, which these cultures actually were trying to construct rigorous learning. And I think that was very clear yesterday in a lot of the comments that came out of some of the presentations. These kids want to learn, but they want to learn in a way in which they're able to bring their lives and experiences into the schools. The curriculum construction that goes on around these places are ones that actively work to incorporate things like popular culture, rather than to relegate it to some sort of realm of being outside of school. And they see this as an important facet around which you can actually actively construct a curriculum, and I think Dave the Pirate gave us some good examples of that in his work yesterday. There's also a sense in which students' lives really become, students' lives and emotions are actually brought into the centrepiece of these places. Students' lives, in short, students are listened to and trusted, I think, in these places. Behaviour management was an important thing here, and this was regarded not so much as a mechanism of discipline, but when behaviour management issues occurred, it was frequently described as an indicator that the curriculum was not working properly, that it was inappropriate, or it was being propagated in ways that weren't working for the kids. There was elements of flexibility in the way in which the timetabling kind of worked in these places, scheduling of student commitments. I think the example Dave gave yesterday of the kid who was counselled, who left his class and so on and so forth, was a classic case of that. The pedagogy that's used in these places has a mutually respectful tone about it, and above all, students are listened to. There are high levels of mutual trust between students and teachers, but most importantly, there's a pastoral care approach that goes on in these places that acknowledges and connects to students' wider lives. Now, that was something that we hadn't started out to look for, but we found it. We were told about it pretty clearly. The second dimension that we came across from what the students were telling us was what we described as a passive school. This was a school that was confused, I think would be the best way to describe it. Its culture came across as kind of benign. It was struggling, but with limited success, to come to grips with the rapidly changing nature of contemporary youth. In terms of inclusion and exclusion, many of the students described themselves as having been eased out of this school by a school that was trying to present itself as acting in their best interest, but it was still actually had a fairly elitist kind of view, that the curriculum was only satisfying a minority of the students. What Raywin Connell interestingly described as the competitive academic curriculum. Connell then abbreviated that to read as the CAC, C-A-C. So the issue of the curriculum construction, in this particular orientation, there seems to be a failure to understand the importance of curriculum relevance to the lives of students. It looks at things superficially, and while these schools seem to have the appearance of being nice places on the surface, underneath they're actually places in which everything is strongly stacked against the kids. In terms of their lives and emotions, they do acknowledge that kids have emotional needs, but they deal with these in a fairly immature way. Behaviour management, there seems to be a lack of attention to acting equitably and consistently, and this seems to be the case because they don't have any underlying philosophy towards students. On the issue of flexibility, they're fairly inflexible places. Students told us they require much more sophisticated understandings of young people than was able to be displayed here. Their pedagogy, students find that these are places that have a curriculum, teaching and assessment practices that are boring and uninteresting. And what passes as teaching often more accurately amounts to misteaching because of the multitude of lost opportunities for connecting in real ways with young people's lives. And pastoral care, while these schools have pastoral care, their way of handling it is to see young people as bringing deficits or some sort of social pathologies. So in terms of the passive school, there's an understanding of young lives here that I think produces a culture of dependence rather than one of independence, and process probably at worst of writing over lives and experiences of young people rather than seeing how they can actually fit in. Which really brings me to the third archetype, which was really the one that we, I guess, started out thinking we were going to find, because this was one that typified the sort of circumstances that had propelled most of the kids out of school. And we called this the aggressive school. It was aggressive in the sense that it seemed to distinguish itself by an emphasis on a climate of fear, silence and resentment, usually embodied in a strong discipline policy in the school. And to put this another way, there was a pervasive absence of trust and respect in young lives. On the sort of dimension of inclusion and exclusion, there was a tendency to frame success in terms of middle-class norms for students pursuing an academic curriculum to university entrance. And students who didn't actually fit that were actually described as being troublemakers. Often these were the same students who had a robust sense of justice and were prepared to take a stand against what they regarded as school policies that were disrespectful of them. On the level of curriculum construction, these schools also fitted with what Connell called the CAC. There were processes of streaming that often undermined students' self-images of themselves. As to the lives and emotions of these students, this was a matter in which emotions were supposedly to be parked at the school gate or classroom door. These were things that were not to be brought into the school. Behaviour management, policies and guidelines were enforced in ways that left little doubt, and we heard lots of stories about the consequences of failure to comply, especially around things like prohibited substances. Students who got caught up in the implementation of these policies were on an escalator straight out of the school. They were cascaded out. Flexibility, there was high levels of compliance demanded. Their pedagogy didn't have ways of caring and dealing with students who were speaking back. Pastoral care, issues of harassment and sexism, racism and classism were rampant, often with an attitude of indifference on the part of the school which regarded these matters as being the rightful domain, not being rightfully the domain of the school. Now, that was the essence of the kind of study. What's gone on since then is some threads from further research, and we'll see how far we kind of get with this. There's the book that came out of that called Dropping Out, Drifting Off, Being Excluded. And I've put one caption there, students stress sense of fairness and justice, and they certainly did that. With all of that in mind, what they were speaking into existence was a set of conditions around which they wanted their voices to be heard, to be treated with respect, to have a say in matters like school uniforms, that seemed to be a major one, to be listened to and have their wishes and interests taken into account in the choice of subjects and scheduling of their assignments, to be treated fairly and consistently in respect of discipline policies, to have issues of harassment by teachers and students taken seriously, and to be empathetically listened to and heard to regarding the complexity and individuality of their lives. I guess I spent the next dozen or so years kind of repeating much of the same thing. What we did in the next study, which was called Teachers in the Middle, Reclaiming the Wasteland of the Adolescent Years of Schooling, was that we actually did case studies of half a dozen schools in some pretty disadvantaged areas in South Australia. Schools that had high proportions of the kids that we would expect to drop out, but in which that wasn't actually happening. And they were places that were working against the expectations, and kids were not actually leaving. And so what we found, broadly speaking, in those schools was what I described in the earlier work as active school cultures. That was the way they positioned themselves. They were often drawing off the educational philosophy and principles of middle schooling. They were places that described themselves as being overwhelmingly about pedagogically engaging their students. And they were doing this quite remarkably using the internal resources of the school rather than relying on systems-driven imperatives or reforms. Collectively, they displayed their features around culture, pedagogy and structure. By this point in the trajectory of the work, we realised that the problem was much more complicated in schools. And so the next phase of work, which came out in the book called Critically Engaged Learning, was a process of actually looking at the way in which communities, we needed to start looking at the communities in which these young people came from. And we looked at two instances. One in Victoria, around a neighbourhood renewal program that involved school amalgamations, building new schools, ostensibly incorporating elements of the community into it and so on. And I have to say that I think, looking at it, this was something that was a pretty spectacular failure, despite massive amounts of money going into it. On the other hand, we did some work in Western Australia, which used a much more what I call indigenous approach to research that seemed to be much more effective. Externally imposed and very expensive models in Victoria produced a lot of problems. The case in Western Australia seemed to produce instances that people used their own resources and ingenuity to be able to connect these things. The study that came after this one was a study called Hanging In With Kids in Tough Times, Engagement in Context of Educational Disadvantage in the Relational School. And here, I guess the way to summarise this, if we can summarise it in a few words, is this was a story about schools that were going the extra yards for the kids. Incidentally, we picked up a prestigious award for that piece of research in America, which was still been largely ignored in this country. What we explored in this study was a cluster of 4 schools. Our research question was, what is it that animates teachers to hang in with the most difficult kids? And this is where we began to explore the notion of building the relational school, which had its genesis a decade earlier. And in the end, it came back to those same bunch of things that I've already talked about. Relationships, respect, trust and care. Organisation that was flexible, that was student-focused, that was supportive. A pedagogy that was around connectedness and that was challenging, that was rigorous and that was fun. And a community, a view of community that regarded it as being inclusive and being incorporated as a valued resource. And one of the defining hallmarks of this particular piece of research that we found was the importance of place-based learning, which was around constructing curriculum around kids' lives. By that point, I've reached a stage where we're looking at kids who've dropped out, to use that language, kids who've left school early, but who've reconnected. And this particular study here, the study From Silent Witnesses to Active Agents, was about kids who had regained control over their learning. And these were kids who were, in those terms I used at the beginning, who'd been exiles and having something important to say. So we had conversations with 100 or so of these kids across 6 programs and the adults who were working with them. And really the questions were, how did you get to be here? How does this differ from your previous experience of schooling, and how's it changed your life? And the kids told us some quite remarkable stories about those things that fitted with some of those earlier things that we saw. So what we found in this one was that what propelled them out of school was the aggressive kind of culture. What caused them to reconnect and re-engage was the active school, the active culture, the one that contributed to the reconstruction and rehabilitation and re-engagement. And out of that one, we kind of started to develop a much clearer idea about what we call the manifesto of the relational school looked like. Moved slightly in a new direction. By this point, the work had taken a slightly different direction. I'm working with a guy in England at this stage, in Scotland actually, living on the edge, rethinking poverty, class and schooling. Poor kids need rich teaching, I guess is the basis of it. Rich kids get the rich get richer and the poor get direct instruction. Seemed to be a nice summary of it. So this was a book, a way of challenging the deficit views and explanations of the kind of kids in their communities that we talked about in the aggressive and the passive schools. What we did in this book, Terry Wrigley and myself, is that we started out to puncture what we call a whole lot of bad theory and to replace it with some more and better thought out alternatives. So we were, in this book, trying to understand class and poverty. We were trying to move beyond blaming individuals, families and communities and trying to reinvent the role of schooling. Boy, I've been busy, haven't I? Here's book number 7, called Becoming Educated, Young People's Narratives of Disadvantaged Class, Place and Identity. And this was a book about, that we talked about making over what is called a residualised school. I've said in my notes here, this is a finale for me. Well, not quite, but almost. We wanted the kids' narratives of what school meant to them. And we studied 2 disadvantaged Victorian high schools by looking at kids' aspirations and the resources they were drawing upon in making lives for themselves and their futures. We were looking at capabilities rather than deficits. And we wanted to drag the issue of social class out of the closet, and as we spoke about this in their lives. So we looked at the importance of place, space and neighbourhoods in the lives of these young people, and we looked at aspirations in quite a different way to what it's often framed in the scholarly literature. We saw it in terms not of individual ways of looking at things, but as access to opportunity resources, young people having and developing navigational maps for themselves, and the precedents they're able to draw upon in their capacity to aspire. So as a consequence, through the voices of the kids, we reframed what we think it means to become educated around confronting a whole lot of things, like, the hands-on vocational myth that exists, whether communities were really broken that these kids came from, whether aspirations was the way to talk about what was going on when they were talking about imagined futures, and whether these things are different or the same. So again, there were strong traces here of student voice in kids making lives for themselves within that hopeful, active school culture. I haven't finished quite yet, I'm getting close. The socially just school, and this one is on display out there, if you're interested in looking at it. This book was really, I guess, in some ways, the final word on what the relational school might look like. And it's serious about speaking back, I think, to what I call the alien and interloper neoliberal policies that we have afflicting schools at the moment. Its argument is that schools, teachers and students are being deeply damaged by current directions and policies, and that a well-researched alternative is available. And I think that seems to be a topic that's going to be picked up pretty shortly in a following session here. So I want to conclude on this point here. The framework for the socially just school emerged out of 2 decades of what students have been saying around 2 crucial elements. And they go like this: failure at school is unnecessary, and not succeeding at school is not an option. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Good morning, John. Thank you very much. Over to your right.
Oh,
I've
yes.
really enjoyed reading your work over the last few years, and this is my first opportunity to hear you speak in person, and you're even more impressive in person, so thanks for sharing with us this morning. You may not have been able to see us all taking photos of your slides, but we've learned a lot. I would like to ask you, why is your work more well known in the US and the UK than it is in Australia?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I don't know. It's a very pertinent question. It seems to me that when I was in the UK, the stuff was greeted very differently to what I seem to find it here. Not that I was actually mobbed, but there's certainly a very large fan club there. I think that somehow or other in this country we've bought into this neoliberal policy trajectory, perhaps even more deeply than most other countries have. I can say that as a Victorian because I lived through the Jeff Kennett era of what was called the self-managing schools, which my colleague Stephen Ball at the University of London described more appropriately as the self-damaging schools. So I think my answer probably there is that it's been a pretty hard battle to actually fight, to actually get the airspace, to get heard with this alternative alien interloper ideology that seems to be so kind of prevalent. Occasionally, and I haven't seen it today, but I believe there's something in the newspaper today, a discussion that I had with a journalist yesterday. Occasionally you do get the opportunity to do that, but it's certainly not the case that I haven't been putting the material out there. The only simple answer I can give is that I think it's indicative of where we've arrived at in this country. We've kind of bought into models that actually exclude all other possibilities.
John, I'm mindful of your scholarship in teachers' work, and I'm interested in if you have some comments on the relationship between what you're talking about from student voice and the need for restructuring of schooling and the current situation of teachers' work.
Do you want to just have another crack at that, Steve, so I can get the question and try to answer it in a way that's helpful.
I was trying to be deliberately open to give you some scope there.
Oh, okay. So what, the relationship between teachers' work and the policy regime, is that what you're suggesting? Oh, okay, well, I'll start by having a crack at that. I think one of the things that I look back over the sort of long period I've been doing this stuff, and the thing that really, I guess, hits me most apparently is that I think there's a significant loss of opportunity for teachers to make judgment about their work. So I think increasingly, you know, the stuff there's raining in on them. I mean, I hear in Queensland here that a huge amount of effort and time goes into priming kids up for NAPLAN tests. We did hear a very interesting presentation from John yesterday, I think, where, to put it bluntly, I think what he says is get stuffed. The question is, how do you replicate that? I mean, I think it is. As I had a conversation with him afterwards, I said, I think the question here is really about having courage. That is, the courage of your convictions and a preparedness to actually speak back. The thing that's interesting about the kids is that these kids are speaking back. Now, I don't think that speaking back necessarily means you have to be impudent with this stuff. I think, you know, and I think we heard some really good examples yesterday of people who have been able to find the spaces, the cracks and the crevices within which you can do the really creative work. So part of it, I think, is about, from a teacher's point of view, how do you actually find those spaces? How do you find, and I think, you know, the discussion we heard about using networks to be able to sustain one another. The thing that I think is most damaging to teachers is when you feel like you're the only person dealing with these kind of issues. If you're going to take a stand against something, then you've got to feel as though you're not the only person doing that. And I think the social networks are certainly helpful in doing that. The stories we heard yesterday about the meet and what was it called? The meet and teach meets. Yeah, I think they're a good example of where teachers can really get uplifted. And I don't just mean in terms of sharing tips, but in terms of solidarity, real solidarity about preserving the work. I'm not sure I've answered your question, Steve.
Thank you very much, John, and for all your work and for your talk today. I'm one of those fans who mob you. I guess I want to put to you a hypothetical situation. Yeah, imagine if all our schools were active schools. Would there be a place for what currently is known as the re-engagement program or the alternative school, or would that not be necessary anymore?
Good question. Good question. I was asked this question at a lecture theatre one day when I was doing a lecture to undergraduate students, and the student put it to me in a slightly different way. She says, hey, what's the dropout rate in Finland? Now, not being a very switched on sort of old guy, I wasn't aware that he had his mobile phone there, and so he was checking me out before the answer, and the answer was 3%. I think I said something like that. I think, you know, there are places where I think, you know, very different approaches to the way we think about education are actually having quite different effects. And I keep using the example of Finland because they've done the reverse of what we've done. And the perversity of it is, doing the reverse of what we've done in this country is put them on the top of the league tables. Now, while I'm not a great believer in league tables, I believe in this one. So I think in a lot of ways, the socially just school, and it took me some while to kind of track down, you know, really what was going on in Finland and to understand it properly. But really what the socially just school is the version of, you know, what we've found through our research. Finland has done it as a national system. And the two of these, I've written about these in various places too, bringing the notion of the socially just school into conversation with a system that actually does that. And I think, you know, if you start from a place where teachers are valued, you know, they're highly regarded, they're well paid, you know, it's more difficult to get into teaching than it is in medicine in Finland, all of those kinds of things. I mean, if you start from that, a culture that actually does respect and value teaching does have quite remarkably different effects.